It seems to me that price is a massive missing ingredient in all of this 1p, 2p, 3p, etc. Because, you know, if the price of oil's $30 a barrel, you're not going to be able to economically extract a lot of resources, and if it's $180 a barrel, you'll be able to really chase it quite hard. And I've always been surprised that these 1p, 2p, etc. are never presented as a graph to say, if this is the assumption on price, this is what our reserves look like. So you could look into the financials of a company and see how robust their economics are based on the underlying price of that commodity. And I don't understand why, therefore, a lot of these graphs aren't three-dimensional rather than two-dimensional, where price might come out of the page towards you, and you could see that changing, mix.
Yeah, you're certainly right that price can be a big determinant of whether a project's commercial, and some companies do report the oil price forecast they use, because obviously these systems, unlike the SEC system in the US, which kind of uses a price determined from the previous 12 months. They're not allowed to use a forward forecast, where PRMS and indeed the UN system allows a forecast of prices, and obviously it's very difficult to forecast oil price or any commodity price into the future. And so there is normally reasonableness tests on those price forecasts, and most reserve auditors kind of, will help entities kind of come up with that reasonable view. And I think you're right that understanding that, which is why the ACCC is moving towards perhaps wanting a common price that all companies use, so that you compare like for like. So we can see if Company A and Company B's reserves, we know that they're comparable because they're using the same oil price. Because at the moment they could be using a different price forecast. And some companies do report that, but not everyone does. So it's not a mandatory requirement. But yeah, it could go that way. And maybe even the ACCC, the ASX might head that way as well.
Thank you, Tony Houston. I was fascinated by the hierarchy and your priorities. And I wonder how a company like Santos, and indeed a country like Australia, looks at East Timor, for example, Timor-Leste, where the resource has been fought over, has been manipulated, and there's a high level of disdain within the wider community in the way it's been handled. And I'd like to hear your comment on that.
And I think that's what one of the strengths of a system like the UN system is, because it does force companies to really examine those social and environmental factors and be clear about them in what those, and in addressing them and what those risks are to development. Because at the moment, those kind of issues are fairly opaque when we're talking about reserves and resources. But I agree, if a company or anyone is using this system, then it can be much more transparent about how that's being addressed, and how they're addressing things like community concerns or environmental concerns. But at the moment, the assumption is that if you're reporting reserves, then you expect that either those issues have been addressed or you expect them to be addressed. I mean, that's what reserves are meant to mean. But certainly if you're in a resource space, then those issues may still be a big risk to development. And like I say, I think the UN system is very powerful in that it will provide much more transparency on some of those factors and help companies address them, and help governments and communities kind of understand what these projects are trying to do.
Yeah, Rick.
This is something that obviously in the minerals industry is pretty important as well. How far, a couple of questions, but I guess one of the main ones is, how far off are we from actually seeing companies do that? Because it feels like we're a long way off from companies doing that in the minerals industry, to actually include, environment, social governance factors in the sort of moderation of their resource risks.
Yeah. And certainly, I mean, this particular system, which has got much more traction outside of Australia than perhaps in Australia, certainly a lot of the European and African countries are embracing this system. But I agree, unless it's mandated by governments in terms of how they're wanting you to evaluate your resources, it's going to be difficult to get companies to take this on, or unless systems like JORC and PRMS start to embrace some of the same principles that we see in a system like this. But certainly, I mean, JORC and PRMS can both be mapped to the UN system. It's just that in that mapping, it exposes, I suppose, some of those fundamental issues around those social environment which aren't really addressed in those systems. But unless it's mandated by governments or any reporting requirements, or the systems that we generally use day to day start to take on board some of those same principles, yeah, it's going to be difficult to enforce.
Well, the only other thing I wanted to ask was, the other thing that people brought up in the mineral space around this is not so much that governments would do it, but that the people actually taking the product would do it. That somebody's going to turn around and say, well, I'm not going to buy your copper unless it's green copper, or socially sustainable copper. I don't know if that could be done.
No, that's a really good point. Yeah, if customers said, well, yeah, I'm not going to sign this agreement unless you show me how you've addressed these issues, or how your project stands up using that UN system, I'm not going to go there. So yes, it requires that everyone's aware of the system, and that as more people start to use it, and then there'll be that expectation that you need to address it. Yeah, there'll be an expectation by both customers and the public that you'll be able to talk to those issues and explain them. And this is a system that allows you to do that in a way that is understandable by everyone, I think.
How do you friendly build a system reading, going on from the threat of a client or a producer saying, I'm not buying the product unless you can show me that? What about shareholders? I mean, a lot of shareholders have a lot to say to this day. What about shareholders group also asking for that sort of reporting, I guess, from their company at annual meetings, and then also following on from that, a standard price. Would we get to the stage where a government may say, right, 6 months we're going to use X dollars a barrel, body research and resource based?
Yes. No, you're right. I mean, in terms of user friendliness, I mean, the fact that it is the three-dimensional system perhaps does frighten people a little bit. It looks perhaps a little bit more complicated than some of the systems that we're used to. So I think it's just, so that's just an education session. But I think if it's framed in the context of this is what it's, these are the issues it's trying to take an account of, I think it will get embraced by things like shareholder groups and, like I say, by governments and communities. And I think, like I say, I think there is an expectation now from the community around transparency and ethical accountability in terms of how we're, developing these projects and how we're addressing all those concerns. So, yeah, it certainly has the foundation, I think, to be that system, and it's just going to be an education, a matter of, educating all those groups into how the system works and how it can be used to provide that communication as a communication tool.
Certainly the JORC code already encompasses this, and it requires, as part of the resource and or reserves, looking at licensing and environmental aspects, etc., and seeking of advice of experts in that area if required. But this seems to go much further in terms of having an analysis and consultation process as well, which is actually the role of the EIS. So I wouldn't want to see the EIS process being supplanted by that level of work prior to embarking on the EIS. And in that respect, I think the JORC code adequately outlines the modifying factors and in Table 1, the factors that may lead to the grant of the licence. The only comment I'd make there would be maybe the social expectation, which would be really hard to evaluate without having actually held the social consultation.
No, I agree. I mean, both JORC and PRMS inherent in the system is that you have to address those factors, like you say. And the idea of this system is not to supplant things like the EIS process by any means. It's more just a way of better representing what those social environmental risks are, and then, you know, then things like it's not meant to replace regulatory process at all. It's more just to provide more transparency on those aspects, which are becoming increasingly important. And at the moment, within JORC and PRMS, whilst they're there, they're just not very transparent when we're talking about classification. So this is just a way of making it much more transparent, I suppose, but not to replace regulatory process. That's not the intent, Bob. Yeah, you're right.
It's interesting in terms of, for minerals in the US, SEC has moved to homogenise largely with the JORC code for minerals and coal and so on. And that includes in the pricing area the use of management forecasts. So both JORC and now in the future in the US under the SEC will be using management forecasts rather than standardised pricing, which for coal used to be the three previous years rolling average or current market price.
Yeah, maybe that's where it's gone for solid minerals. I think petroleum still looks at the previous year average, but yeah, maybe it is going in that direction. Could well be.
We might draw it to close. It's an interesting topic, and our gift for presenting, Barbara. Thank you very much.